Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome back to the British Airways Baitak. I hope all of you had a wonderful hot cup of tea in the half-an-hour recess. If you were not already filling up the aisles and seats of the British Airways Baitak for this, what I can guarantee will be an absolutely fascinating and amazing talk. The next talk is entitled God's Traitors, Religious Terrorism in Elizabethan England. And I don't even want to waste a second, so I'm going to invite Jessie Childs and William Dalrymple onto stage and give it away to William to introduce the talk for today.
At roughly the same time that in Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar was calling together representatives of all faiths, Sufi Muslims, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Vaishnav and Shaivite Hindus, Jains, atheist Hindus, Jesuits from Goa, Jews from Kerala, Buddhists from the Himalayas, to discuss what the different faiths had in common and where they varied. In England, a place that now likes to lecture other parts of the world on religious tolerance, Catholics were having their entrails pulled out when they were still alive. They were being tortured, were being roasted on fires, and the idea of religious freedom had not even been invented. We associate terrorist violence and bomb attacks on political figures with the post-French Revolution world, with the world of the anarchists in Paris, more recently, of course, with the whole variety of Al-Qaeda atrocities and related events. But the world's first great attempt at changing a regime through terrorist violence was, of course, the gunpowder plot, the attempt to tunnel under the British Parliament by Guy Fawkes and blow it up. And in the years that followed, Britain saw an extraordinary level of repression against Catholics. And Catholics were considered not only to be dangerous, but to be anti-national. Jessie Childs has spent the last 6, 7, 8 years, first a PhD in 8 years. No PhD. First a PhD, then a book, researching this neglected subject, and one which obviously has extraordinary contemporary resonance, as the huge crowds in this hall bears witness. When I'm programming this festival, it's very difficult to guess what things will strike a chord and which things will fall completely flat. And I had to say, one of the things I thought was least likely was that we would get a completely full house on this show. So I'm pleased give a very, very warm welcome to remarkable young historian, Jessie Childs.
Thanks, Willie. I'll probably... Should we get it over around the back? Hello. I'm afraid I don't have a PhD. That's the one thing. No PhD. Of 8 years. And 2 babies. Are we... Oh, I'm going to stand here. All right. Good evening. Thank you for coming. What a treat. What a treat. And as Willie says, I'm going to talk to you about Catholics in Elizabethan England. So the second half of the 16th century. And it's almost exactly contemporary with Akbar. Elizabeth ruled for 44 years, so she didn't quite make her half century. I don't think Akbar did either, did he? I think he was 4 months off. But like him, she is often celebrated as a golden age ruler and a tolerant ruler. And you'll find out that's not quite right. But before we go there, I actually want to take you about 2.5 centuries forward, just to muddle it up a bit more, to 1828, the reign of George IV, and to this house. Whoops. There we go, this house, Rushden Hall in Northamptonshire. The owner there wanted to do it up. He wanted to vamp it up in the French style. So in went the builders. And one day, one builder was removing a lintel over an ancient doorway in the Great Hall. And something came down with the rubble. It was a book, beautifully bound, clearly quite old. So he hacked away at the wall a little bit more, and he came across something else. He came across a recess about inches wide, and there was something inside it, something wrapped up in a large sheet. So picture his excitement at this stage. He's thinking, ooh, precious heirlooms, hidden treasure, what am I going to do with my money? So imagine his dismay when he unwraps this bundle, and all he finds are more books, papers and books. But for the historians, they really are hidden treasures, because they tell a remarkable story. Those papers belong to this man, Sir Thomas Tresham. He lived at Rushton Hall in the reign of Elizabeth I, and he was Catholic. Elizabeth I was Protestant, and therefore, on paper at least, so was the rest of her realm. And this was a problem for Catholics like Tresham, thousands like him. It got worse as the reign went on. It was messy, it was tragic, it was seemingly insurmountable at times. And those papers of his, the Tresham papers we call them, they're in the British Library, come and see them. They tell the story of that problem, how men and women tried to deal with it, how they tried to live with it, and also how the state tried to deal with it. And it's stories like these, hidden histories, if you like, I mean, literally immured, bricked in for centuries, that tell us so much about the conflicted loyalties, the religious and political loyalties of Elizabethan England. And by the way, it's also just why I love history so much. I'm sure Willie will agree with me. It's sort of that sense of discovery, not my discovery, 1828, but that feeling, that knowledge that the ground is always shifting underneath us. We can never be sure, and there are shifting narratives and shifting perspectives. And it's tremendously exciting, and it keeps us honest, I think, I hope. When I was a child, I saw a priest hole, and that is exactly what it sounds like. It is a hole in a house to hide priests in. And I thought to myself, why would grown-ups want to play hide and seek? And then I forgot about it. It just fell off my radar. I went to a Church of England school, and there it was all about the Protestant national story. It was about Gloriana, good Queen Bess. When we think of Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth I, we tend to think of images like this, iconic portraits. Or if we're really hamming it up, we might think of Kate Blanchett on her charger, if we can get her. Where is she? Well, in armor, on a charger. There we go, there we go. Not even side saddle. And for some in England who love Blackadder, she will always be Queenie. There we are. Do you have Blackadder here? Must be. But what we don't think about so much are the black teeth, the wigs, the smallpox scars. They've been airbrushed. And that's fine. I don't really care about that. It's cosmetic. But her religious reputation has also been airbrushed. She's hailed as this great beacon of toleration. In fact, the founder of our great tradition of tolerance. And it's just not true. Torture was used more in her reign than in any other in British history. The Mass was banned. Catholics, and so were very personal devotional items, things like Agnus Dei's, which is a small wax disc with the imprint of the Lamb of God on it. You often wear it around the neck. It's just a personal devotional item. If that came from Rome, you weren't allowed to bring it into the country. And there's actually a list, a picture of all the things that the guards on duty had to be on the lookout for and would confiscate. And as late as 1959, an electrician working in a house in Berkshire found an Agnus Dei in a box, nailed to a joist, under the floorboards of the attic in that house. People had to hide them. They couldn't wear them openly. And Catholics had to go to Protestant church every Sunday. And if they didn't, they would be fined. And in 1581, that fine was raised to £20 a month, which is thousands of pounds now, tens of thousands of rupees, a crippling sum. And the ones who didn't go to church, the ones who refused, they were called recusants. It comes from the Latin, recusare, to refuse. in 1593, an act was passed stating that recusants could not travel beyond 5 miles of their home without a license. And that sounds like a control order. And worst of all, priests were outlawed. And if you can't have priests, you can't have the Catholic faith. You can't have the sacraments. That was the theory, at least. But what actually happened is Catholic families would send their young boys over to the continent, to Europe, and they would train them up in the seminaries there as Catholic priests. And then they would come back over disguised as jewel merchants or soldiers or schoolmasters, and they would administer to underground congregations secretly. And there are some of them receiving the blessing of Pope Gregory XIII. Note how young they look. Some of them were barely out of their teens. The government responded to this in 1585 with a statute that stated that any priest who'd been ordained abroad since 1559 and who even set foot on English soil would automatically be deemed a traitor, and he would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. As Willie said, your entrails pulled out, your private parts cut off in front of you and burnt in front of you, and then you would be quartered and beheaded. And also, the lay Catholic hosts, the people who put them in their houses, who just welcomed them in, good hospitality, they also would swing for it. They would be hanged. It was a capital felony. This is why there are priesthoods up and down the country. It was hide and seek, but it was no game. Around 200 Catholics were executed in Elizabeth I's reign, essentially for religious crimes, usually for being or for harboring a Catholic priest. And that image on the right, it's a swinging beam hide. It was brilliantly hidden. It was only discovered in 1894 by a boy playing in a derelict wing in a house called Harvington Hall in Worcestershire. You can see why people write novels about this. To be fair to Elizabeth I and her government, though, it wasn't just them making life so hard for the English Catholics. Mary, Queen of Scots, did not help. She was Elizabeth's cousin. She was Catholic. And in 1568, she came to England. She was booted out of Scotland by the Protestant lords there. They forced her abdication. And for the next 20 years or so, she was the focus of Catholic plots against Elizabeth. She was under house arrest. And wittingly or unwittingly, she was involved in those plots. And she had some very, very powerful backers. People like Philip II of Spain, who we have a picture of. Here we go. You don't pose with your hand on a helmet like that unless you really, really mean business. He was sort of the superpower. He ruled over an empire that stretched from Peru to the Philippines, which was named after him. After he annexed Portugal in 1580, he had a medal struck, and it bore the words "Non sufficit orbis." Translation: the world is not enough. He's definitely a very formidable enemy, and he had this almost messianic complex. There's a very good article written by a brilliant historian called Geoffrey Parker, who wrote about the messianic outlook of Philip II, and he really did think it was his duty to convert the world to Catholicism. So there's Philip, and Mary was also supported by a very powerful family in France, the Guise family, very hardline Catholics. They were her relatives. And they were responsible for atrocities like this: the massacre of St. Bartholomew, the massacre of Paris, 1572. It was, well, essentially it was the sanctified slaughter, they called it sanctified, of thousands of French Protestants, Huguenots, they're known as. And the River Seine was said to run red with blood. And one of the most chilling things I read when I was doing my research for this book was a report from the Spanish ambassador in Paris at the time. He was writing to Philip II of Spain. And he put, "As I write, they are killing them all. They are stripping them naked. They are dragging them through the streets. They are sparing not even a babe." And actually, if you look in that picture, there are babies. And you're sort of, as I was reading it, it was very early on in my research. I got hardened to all this later. But I was expecting some sort of official condemnation. Not a bit of it, not a bit of it. He carries on, he says, "Blessed be God who has converted the French princes to his cause. May he inspire their hearts to continue as they have begun." This is what we're dealing with. You know, he didn't want it to stop. He wanted to carry on. This was God's work, and it was great to him. very real, very visceral fear of Catholicism creeping into English culture at this time, even though it's the ancient national faith, even though Protestantism is a very new religion. It's essentially an import from cities like Strasbourg and Zurich and Wittenberg. I mean, even the word Protestant comes from the protestation of Speyer in 1529, and it was the imperial cities protesting against the Holy Roman Emperor's ban on Martin Luther. It wasn't really until the 1580s or so that Protestants were happy to call themselves Protestants. But still, there is this sort of terror of Catholicism. And of course, before Elizabeth I, there was the reign of her half-sister Mary. It was a short reign, but she did a lot of damage. She's known as Bloody Mary to many people in England still, because almost 300, about 280 Protestants were burnt at the stake for being Protestant, for not being Catholic. And there are some really, really grisly descriptions. A chap called John Fox wrote it all up, and he was very graphic. He wrote about human juices dripping from bodies as they roasted at the stake. He wrote about lips moving in prayer until they melted away in the flames. And one of the canniest things, actually, that Elizabeth's ministers did in the next reign was to make sure that there was a copy of this book, The Acts and Monuments of John Fox, in every cathedral church and as many parish churches as possible. So people would go to church, they would come to the lectern, it would be chained here alongside the Bible, but it was far more interesting, the Bible, because it had these woodcuts. And so they would flick through and they would read these horrible descriptions, and they would see pictures like this, which is a woman from Guernsey in 1556. She was burnt as a heretic, she was pregnant. She gave birth at the stake, and this is when you sort of think it might be a slight bit of propaganda, because the baby flew out, apparently, and one of the guards didn't know what to do with it. And then they decided they would throw it back in the flames because it was a heretic's baby, allegedly. But they would look at these pictures, and they would be terrified of Catholicism. And Elizabeth was nothing like Mary. She really wasn't. I do believe that. And I think, especially in the first decade or so of her reign, she really didn't want to force consciences. She didn't want religious violence. But what she did expect was conformity. And she had conformed in Mary's reign, which is quite important to remember that. It sort of tells you a lot about her outlook. She'd gone to Mass, whereas Mary, before, in her half-brother Edward VI's reign, refused Protestant communion. And by the way, I'm sorry about this yo-yoing of official religion. I mean, if you're confused, imagine what it must have been like for them. I mean, they all were. And it's one of the reasons I write about a family, because I think it helps you notice change through the generations. And Lord Vaux, who I'm trying to show you, there he is. Lord Vaux was born in 1535, so the reign of Henry VIII. It's actually the year that Sir Thomas More was executed. Henry VIII is going through his break with Rome at this stage. He essentially broke with Rome initially to marry Anne Boleyn. And then he dissolved the monasteries, but he always kept the Mass. And he had a few sort of theological quandaries, and he wasn't sure about purgatory, but he kept the Mass, the cornerstone of Catholic worship. And actually, it was a capital offense. You would be burnt at the stake if you denied the real presence of Christ in the body and blood, so, in the bread and wine. You deny that it was the body and blood of Christ. So it's still Catholic. But then his son comes along in 1547, Edward VI. He was 9 years old, and he is hailed as Josiah, the boy king who will destroy idolatry. And that's exactly what he did, sort of Taliban style. He smashed up all the statues, he ripped down the rood screens, and all the paintings were whitewashed, stained glass was smashed, and the Mass was banned. And Protestants, reformers, they really believed that the way the priest would reenact Christ's sacrifice on the cross and transform the bread and the wine, transubstantiate, to use the official term, into the body and blood of Christ. The reformers thought that this was a mummery. They thought that priests were charlatans. And there's one theory that the term hocus pocus might be a corruption or a parody of the Latin words of consecration. Hoc est enim corpus meum. If you take out a few words, you have hoc est corpus, hocus pocus. It's possible. It's a good theory. Edward VI dies after 6 years, and then you get Bloody Mary and the burnings. And then in 1558, Elizabeth I comes to the throne. She's Protestant, but she's not quite as radical as Edward. So it's very confusing. And Lord Vaux here, he lived through 3 changes of monarch, 4 if you include Lady Jane Grey, and he had seen his beloved mass revered, abolished, restored, and abolished again. And he prayed fervently for just one more swing of the pendulum. And people like Lord Burleigh, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, Queen Elizabeth's chief advisor and Lord Treasurer, who, I don't know where I should be pointing this, there he is, he prayed just as hard for that not to happen. Now we know that that's it. We know Elizabeth will go on for 44 years and there'll be no more swings of the pendulum. But they didn't. And I think if we're going to understand this period at all, and actually, I mean, it stands for all history, we have to remember that. We have to suspend hindsight. And we have to forget what we read in 1066 and all that, which is a book that we were all brought up on in England, sort of parody of history. And it's very funny, and often it's very accurate. And they said of Mary, broody Mary's reign was a bad thing, since England is bound to be Church of England, so all the executions were wasted. And that, in a nutshell, is the Protestant Whig view of English history. And it's proved remarkably durable. But on the ground, things were far more confusing and messy, and especially on the 25th of February, 1570, when Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth I. So he called her a heretic, but he also said that she was illegitimate and that Catholics had a duty to disobey her. And in fact, if they didn't, they too would be excommunicated. So the poor Catholics in England, they have this terrible dilemma. It's a choice of 2 betrayals. Do you betray the Pope and condemn your soul to damnation? Or do you betray Queen Elizabeth, your queen, and submit your body to all kinds of temporal punishment? And they couldn't, in good conscience, do both. So what do? Well, a lot of them actually fudged it. They sort of did the equivalent of crossing your fingers. So they went to church to avoid the fine. But they would do things like they would talk through the sermon, or they would keep their hat on throughout. Or my favorite is a chap called Richard Sherburn, who over 2 decades, whenever he went to church, he put wool in his ears so he didn't have to hear the services. And these guys are known pejoratively as church papists. And by the way, it's very hard to give you good statistics, good figures on this, because obviously prescribed faiths don't necessarily advertise their membership. But the eminent historian John Bossy estimated, I think it's quite a conservative estimate, but he estimated that in 1603, the end of Elizabeth's reign, there were probably about 40,000 of these guys. And of that number, only a very small fraction, about 8,500 or so, were the recusants, the refusers, the refuseniks. William Shakespeare's father, John, was one, and another was Lord Vaux. And I'll bring him back to you. There he is. He is the most unlikely rebel you will ever meet. Everyone loved him. Even the Protestants loved him. He was a peer of the realm. He sat on all the county commissions. He loved dancing. He loved plays. He loved hunting. He loved his children. Simon Calais, he reviewed my book in The Guardian, and he called Vaux the Earl of Emsworth in a ruff. And that's right, there is something sort of Woodhouseian about him. But everything changed for him. 5 years after that portrait was painted, in 1580, Lord Vaux welcomed back into his house his children's former schoolmaster. That man was Edmund Campion. He had gone away a decade earlier, and he had come back disguised as a jewel merchant. Why? Because he was a priest. He trained as a priest. And not only that, he was a Jesuit. Now, when we think of the Jesuits today, we think of good exam results, and we think of lovely Pope Francis, and it's all very positive benign. Well, maybe not in the last week or so, but the Pope before Charlie Hebdo. And it's hard to imagine quite how reviled they were in the 16th century. I mean, not, I should add, by Akbar, he welcomed them. He wanted to debate with them, and he was so much more enlightened than Elizabeth. But in England, the Jesuits were seen as very hardline. They were new religious order. They had an extra special vow of obedience to the Pope, and they had a Spanish soldier as a founder. So they're seen as very militant, very hardline. And Campion, when he launched the Jesuit mission in 1580 with Robert Parsons, they were very controversial. They said that all the church papists were sinning, and they would have to stop that, no more conformity. And they challenged Queen Elizabeth to a debate. And Campion wrote things like this. He said, "The expense is reckoned. The enterprise is begun. It is of God. It cannot be withstood. So the faith was planted, so it must be restored." That kind of language absolutely terrified the Elizabethan authorities. They hunted him down. They caught up with him. They tortured him. That's him on the rack. He was asked how his hands and feet felt after a session on the rack, and he said, "Not ill, because not at all." He was executed on the 1st of December 1581, and when he'd been on the rack, he gave up the names of some of the guys who'd put him up in their houses, and Lord Vaux was one of them. And so he was arrested, he was tried, he spent the rest of his life first in prison in the Fleet, then he was under house arrest in Hackney. He was finally allowed to go home, but he was fined every month. In 1587, he had to give up 2/3 of his land because he couldn't pay his fines. And his brother-in-law, Sir Thomas Tresham, who I introduced you to at the beginning of the talk, he describes seeing Vaux at this stage with tears streaming down his cheeks. And he was broken. He was broken physically and mentally by the end. And I really do think that what happened to him radicalized the children. They couldn't do anything about it. They just saw their father being broken and they were helpless. And you certainly see it with his son Henry Vaux, who started off as a poet. He was a young poet, but he became one of the chief cogs in the underground mission. He funded the whole thing, and he received all the intelligence about which priests were coming where, which safe houses they should go to, that kind of thing. But he was arrested, he spent a spell in prison, and he died very young. And then what I find quite interesting is that his sisters step up. So Eleanor Brooksby and Anne Vaux. And for the next 20 years or so, they keep the new head of the Jesuits, Henry Garnet, alive and working. So they funded him, they traveled with him, and they ran a huge network of safe houses. It was quite complex. And they traveled also with a chap called Nicholas Little John Owen, who was a carpenter, and he was very small, and he could make these incredible priest holes. Henry Garnet called Anne and Eleanor the widow and the virgin. And I wish I could show you some pictures of them, but I can't, nor are there any marked graves for them. And that's really the point. They flew under the radar. And it was quite helpful to be a woman in this sense, because women in the 16th century were perceived to be inferior to men. They just weren't as important. They didn't have the same status in the law. So, for example, a wife, when she married, would lose all her property. It would go to her husband, which can't be much fun, but it did at least have the advantage of meaning that she couldn't be fined, or at least it was very, very hard to fine her. There was nothing to fine, there was nothing to take. And there was a saying in Northamptonshire at the time that was, "The disbelieving husband shall be saved by the believing wife." But I have to be careful. The next picture I'm going to show you is not very nice. It's just to tell you that one can't generalize too much. 3 women were put to death in Elizabeth I's reign for helping priests. And one of them was this lady, Margaret Clitheroe. She was pressed to death. She was stripped just to a linen shift. A door was placed on top of her, and 700 or 800 weight was put on top of the door until her ribs crushed. Not for protecting priests, but for refusing to plead to the charge of protecting priests. So that's just a little reminder that we can't generalize too much. Having said that, I'm going to generalize again and say that a lot of officials, when they came banging on the doors and trying to find these priests, there was a squeamishness among it. And they're not all. There was one guy called Richard Topcliffe, the chief priest hunter. He was a torturer and a sadist and a rapist, and he absolutely loved loved his job. But most of them didn't. Most of them were cousins, kinsmen, neighbors, and they did have a problem about invading the domestic sphere, especially when it was a feminine sphere. And you can see why they would walk in on a scene like this, if we can get it. There we go, ladies sewing. What could be more innocent? But actually, they're probably sewing vestments, and there's probably a priest or two hidden around. And the women, it reminds me of a speakeasy, actually, that picture. The women took full advantage of this. There was one story with Eleanor's adopted daughter called Frances Burrow. She was 11 years old, and the priest hunters banged on the door. And she said, "Oh, put up your swords, for my mother will die. She cannot bear to see a naked blade." And behind her, Eleanor's sort of going, "Oh." So they do, they sort of stand there and they don't start raiding the house quite yet. And they let Frances go off and get a drink for her swooning mother. And of course, what she's doing is hiding the priests, hiding the massing equipment. There was another case, a very famous raid that happened probably in Baddesley Clinton here in Warwickshire. It happened in 1591, the 19th of October, 1591, and there were 7 priests in the house. There were a lot, more than usual, because they'd had a meeting. And there was the usual banging, bang, bang on the door. It's very early, because they always tried to catch them break of day when they were saying mass. So Eleanor actually hid. She was terrified, so she hid in her own priest hole. But they gathered up, all the priests went down, and just above the waterline there, all the way along on the foundation wall, was a sewer hide. So they were ankle deep in water for about 4 hours. And when Anne finally opened the door, and they got rid of all the traces of Catholicism, and they'd also upturned the beds so they wouldn't feel warm to the touch, so that it wouldn't betray the fact that more people had slept over that night than could be accounted for. Anyway, Anne finally opened the door, and instead of sort of apologizing for the delay, she subjected them to a barrage of Danish outrage. And she said, "How dare you come to my house so early? The women, the servants, the children, they're not out of bed yet. Why keep coming to my house so early? Why this lack of manners?" And they were sort of terribly sorry. But they did. They searched through the whole house. They knocked through everything. They pulled up the floorboards. Anne said they were like a party of boys playing blind man's buff, who in their wild rush to break everything couldn't find their playfellows right underneath them. In the end, after 4 hours, she gave them breakfast, she gave them a bribe, and off they went, and she could let the priests out. And Henry Garnet was full of admiration for Anne. He said, "Though she has all a maiden's modesty and even shyness, yet in God's cause and in the protection of his servants, Virgo becomes virago." That's how you give praise to a woman in the 16th century. You call her a virago, a warrior woman. So it's been fun. Stories like that are fun. There's also a wonderful Jesuit priest called John Gerard who wrote his autobiography, and he got away. He got out of England after the Gunpowder Plot. And for me, it's the most exciting document in the whole Tudor period. It's incredibly swashbuckling, incredibly partisan. And also quite grim at times. So he describes very, very graphically the way he was tortured. And he says that he was taken in a sort of procession through a dark alleyway, just with candles in front of him, by a group of guards. And then finally they sort of ended up in this underground, subterranean, huge room. And inside was every kind of torture instrument you could ever imagine. And they said to him that he would try them all. And they started off with something called the manacles, which is sort of handcuffs, and he was hung like that for 2 days. And every time he kept passing out, so they would then hold him up, and then they would drop him again. It's grisly. Having said that, there is a happy ending for Gerard. About 6 months later, he escaped. He was in the Tower of London. There we go. Just at the sort of bottom right-hand corner, he was in the cradle tower on the roof. And he escaped with the help of an orange. How? Why? Well, he bribed his warder to get him oranges, and he cut the pith into little crosses, and he turned them into little rosaries. And he said to his warder, "Can you just pass these on to my friends on the outside to let them know that I'm all right? I'm keeping the faith." And the warder took a little bribe, and he thought there's no harm in that. But actually, on the wrapping paper, just the white, blank paper, message. And Gerard knew that orange juice is a rather brilliant invisible ink. If you write on it, on paper, it will disappear, and then if you put it up to a candle or the fire, the writing will come out, and then it is indelible. And I know this for sure, because I tried it with my children. I've got young children, and we spend a weekend doing it, and I promise you, I've never had a weekend where historical research and childcare come together so beautifully. I'm sure I never ever will again either. But anyway, the message said, come and get me. I will be on the roof of the Cradle Tower. And let's pretend his friends are in that boat there. And they had a weighted rope in their boat. They attached one end to the wharf. They threw the other end up to Gerard. He fixed his side, and he literally worked his way across the rope, over the moat, and onto freedom. But he'd only been tortured 6 months earlier. So at one stage he was dangling over the moat. And he said that he prayed, and God gave him the strength, and off he went to safety. And stories like that are great fun. It's really easy to root for Gerard and people like him. So I think just in conclusion, I should say a few words in defense of good Queen Bess, poor old Bess, who sort of gets a bit of hammering from me. Two things really to bear in mind. One is that this was the age of assassination. There were plots against her, loads of plots. I mean, in the 1580s, it almost felt like a continuum of plots. And they were real, they were assassination attempts. In Europe, it was happening. They were working. Regent Moray in Scotland in 1570 was shot dead. William of Orange, 1584 in the Netherlands. 1589, Henry III of France, 1610, Henry IV of France. It goes on. Assassinations were happening. Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, said quite early in the reign, actually, in 1568, he said, there is less danger in fearing too much than too little. And I think, maybe we can understand that. The other thing to bear in mind is that England was at war with Spain, the Spain of Messianic Philip. 1585, it became official. And that year, William Allen, who founded one of the seminaries, the first English seminary on the continent, he wrote to the Pope, and he basically asked him to sanction a holy war against England. And he said, only fear makes the Catholics obey Queen Elizabeth. That fear will be removed when they see the force from without. And the force from without was the Armada. It came 3 years later. The Spanish Armada, 130 ships, came to attack England. And all the recusants like Tresham and Lord Vaux, they were arrested. The moment the intelligence came that the Armada was on its way, they were arrested and they were imprisoned as a precaution. And Tresham complained. He complained bitterly. He sent these petitions to the Queen saying, please let me fight for you. I am a good English loyal subject, and I want to fight in your vanguard if necessary, without arms if necessary. And he's often held up, Tresham, as the example that you can be a good Catholic and a good Englishman. And throughout Elizabeth's reign, he would send these petitions. He would say, suffer us not to be the only outcasts and refuse of the world. Let it not be treason for a dying Catholic to receive the last rites. It's very evocative. But also we have to bear in mind that Tresham, those papers that I told you about at the beginning, he was in touch with the Queen's enemies. We can read it there. We also know from the Spanish ambassador that he was involved in at least one plot, 1582, against Elizabeth. And in those papers, there's one where the mask slips. It's dated to around the end of Elizabeth's reign. And in it, he basically says that Elizabeth is a bastard. She's illegitimate. She has no right to rule, and that Mary Queen of Scots had a far, far, far better claim. So, we've got to be careful with Tresham and his loyalties. And it's, you can understand again why the state couldn't quite feel they could trust him. I mean, in the end, he never had to be truly tried. He was in prison, and the Armada never quite made it. God blue went the motto, and they were scattered. And the victory was hailed not just as England beating Spain, but it was a victory for Protestantism over Catholicism, of truth over falsehood, of freedom over tyranny. And Elizabeth I was hailed, there's Tresham again, sorry, it was hailed as the Virgin Queen. The dramatist wrote that she brought up, the dramatist Thomas Dekker, she brought up even under her wing a nation that was almost forgotten and born under her, that never shouted any other Ave than for her name. It's pure spin. Ave Maria, the Hail Mary. There were thousands of Catholics still saying their Hail Marys, but they didn't fit into this predestined Protestant version of English history. And poor old Tresham, he described his life as moth-eaten. He said he was drenched in a sea of shameless slanders. He died 2 years after Elizabeth I. He'd hoped for some toleration under her successor, James I, James VI of Scotland. It wasn't to be. He died on the 11th of September, 1605. And the following month, his wife's nephew, Robert Catesby, the ringleader of the Gunpowder Plot, tried to recruit his son, Francis, into the plot. Francis was arrested on the 12th of December, 1605. 12th of November, 1605. And he died in the Tower of London before he could face trial. And 2 weeks later, on or around the 28th of November, 1605, all the family papers, all the Tresham papers were gathered up, they were wrapped up in a sheet, and they were bricked in to the walls of Rushton Hall. And they lay there, undisturbed for over 2 centuries, until in 1828, the builders came in.
I asked Jessie to speak for 40 minutes. She's spoken for exactly 40 minutes without looking at a single note and has been completely brilliant throughout. I thought it was an amazing performance, Jessie. Thank you so much. Just say a little bit more about the Gunpowder Plot for people here that don't actually know about it. I mean, this is the mother of all great terrorist incidents. This is the ultimate sort of 24 plot, isn't it, of Elizabethan history.
Yes.
Jack Bauer wasn't around to... Francis Walsingham was the Jack Bauer, wasn't he? Or...
Yeah, you could say that, yeah. And I'm glad you asked, because I didn't really go into the Gunpowder Plot at all. It's sometimes people say it's our 9/11. It was the plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament with gunpowder. And it was at the state opening of Parliament, so it would have been the King, the Lords, the bishops, the judges, pretty much the whole entire elite. And it was also symbolic, because Parliament is where all the acts were passed against the recusants. But it wasn't like 9/11 in 2 senses. One, it failed. Guy Fawkes was discovered the night before. Can you hear me? Is it a bit thingy? Yeah. With his gunpowder. He had a watch, he had a match, and he had 36 barrels of gunpowder. But it also isn't like 9/11 in the sense that they weren't suicide bombers. They really, genuinely wanted to take over the country. There was a whole other part of the plot, if you like, in the Midlands.
This is like 24. So the part 1 is they blow up Parliament, and then there's a second whole...
Exactly. And then it sort of ends, and a lot of them they were all rounded up, the plotters, and the ones in prison were tried and hanged, drawn, and quartered. But then the ringleader, Catesby, and a few of the others sort of had this, they ended up in this house called Holbeach House in Staffordshire, and it was a real Butch and Sundance moment when they had the shootout, and out they came, and they were all killed.
But they burrowed under Parliament, is that right? Or
That's right, yeah. The first plan was they rented this room next door, and the plan was to sort of do a tunnel and to get, but they had real problems with that, and they couldn't get through the wall. And it was all going a bit hairy, and Parliament kept being prorogued as well for plague, so it kept being delayed. But then they had a stroke of luck, and there was this lady, I think she was a coal merchant, and she moved, she vacated her premises. They were underneath the House of Lords at the time, and so it would have done incredible damage.
And how were they caught? What was the...
Well, Guy Fawkes was, there was an anonymous tip-off, something called the Monteagle letter, and even now, we all have our theories, but no one knows who wrote it.
What's your theory?
I think it's Francis Tresham, Sir Thomas Tresham's son. He was a very late recruit.
The loyal Catholic.
Yeah. And he was very reluctant. He wasn't really a gunpowder plotter. He's named as a gunpowder plotter, but he was a very reluctant terrorist. And the letter was received by Tresham's brother-in-law, Lord Monteagle, and it basically said, don't go to Parliament in the next few weeks, because everyone who does will receive a blow, and they won't see where it came from. And Monteagle took the letter to Cecil, Robert Cecil, William Cecil's son, and he then took it to James, and James, the Scot, whose father had been blown up at Kirk-a-Field, knew exactly what that meant. He knew, he was terrified.
Kirkfield's been the time when...
Sorry, yes, yeah.
In Mary Queen of Scots.
Exactly. His father, Lord Darnley, was killed in an explosion. So he was very alert to anything that sort of said a blow. And so the cellars were searched. During the first search, they saw a shady-looking guy, Guy Fawkes, but they didn't take him then. They did a second search, and then they discovered the faggots and 36 barrels of gunpowder. And Fawkes was taken off. He said his name was John Johnson. It's the worst, the worst fake name you could ever give. And he was tortured horribly. And actually, there's a really, if you ever go to the National Archives in Kew in England, you see his signature before torture, and then you see it after torture, and it's shaky and faint and horrible. And he gave up all the details. But by then, actually, the sheriff's posse were after Catesby and his lot anyway in the Midlands, because they'd been stealing horses and stealing arms. So it all sort of came together.
Is there a good movie of the Gunpowder Plot?
There really
obvious,
isn't.
Yes,
There should be. I mean, there's V for Vendetta, and Antonia Fraser wrote about the Gunpowder Plot. Actually, I stole her subtitle with permission, but her subtitle was Terror and Faith in 1605. Mine's Terror and Faith in Elizabethan England. But there was going to be a radio play. William Boyd had written the script, I think, and then 9/11 happened, and it was. You don't glorify terrorism in any way. Yeah.
And tell me a little bit about the Elizabethan Intelligence Agency. Was there a spy agency? What was there?
It's funny.
Francis Walsingham being the...
Yeah, I mean, you kind of think that there should be MI5 and MI6 equivalents, and people sometimes say that Sir Francis Walsingham was the founder of, but actually it was very informal and casual and private. I mean, they would pay out of their own purse. So people like Francis Walsingham, and another one is Robert Cecil later, they had their own little sort of private army of spies, and a lot of them were real sort of reprobates who wanted a bit of money, and it was all quite unreliable.
But done from their house? There was no kind of... I mean, there was an army with an army base. There was no intelligence.
Not really, not as we think of it now. I mean, he had some deputies. So there was a guy called Thomas Philippes, who was a very, very good decipherer. And so, there were certain people that he would outsource things to. But really, it all landed on his desk, and it wouldn't get filed properly. And even now, you've got to look everywhere for these people. And they crop up in the state papers, and then in the Cecil papers, and other people's houses. It's quite extraordinary. But Walsingham is sort of almost Rumsfeldian. The great quote from Walsingham, he was involved. Mary Queen of Scots eventually was executed in 1587, and it was sort of agile profiteers, and it was arguably entrapment. And Walsingham defended himself at Mary's trial. She said, "How could you do this to me?" And he said, I hope I get this right, he said, "I have not done anything as a private man unworthy of an honest man, nor as a public man unworthy of my calling." And then he said, "I protest before God that as a man curious of my mistress's safety, I have been careful." He's basically saying, I've done some shady stuff.
Some shady stuff. One other thing, again, just to draw these parallels very clear for this audience, just talk a little bit more about the kind of Talibanization of England under Edward, because the scale of the destruction of images, I think, is not known here.
Yeah.
This was the massive iconoclasm of English history.
Yes.
Every cathedral, every stained glass window, every statue, every crucifix, up in flames,
and
destroyed,
the rood screens,
decapitated.
Yeah, everything. So if you imagine the Catholic Church, and a historian called Eamon Duffy wrote this brilliant book called The Stripping of the Altars. And the altars were where you would have mass and the reenactment of Christ's sacrifice. So all the candles would go there, and all the images, and that's sort of symbolic. But yes, I mean, if you imagine a Catholic church before Edward's reign, you would have bells, you would have incense, it would be brightly coloured, there would be images
a bit like a
of the
Hindu
saints.
temple.
Yes, exactly, and it would be just this complete assault on the senses, in the best possible way. Although I'm not Catholic, by the way, so I'm very objective. But from an aesthetic point of view, I mourn what was lost.
Okay.
Yes. But then afterwards, after this stripping of the altars, after the smashing up of the statues and the stained glass and the whitewashing, then you can imagine going to a church and it's white. And there's some decorative lettering. They would put the Old Testament on the walls. Sort of.
This is a direct parallel with...
Yeah.
Here you'd have a Tukluk masjid in the 14th century, entirely white, but with only Kufic.
Really?
Kufic stuff.
Gosh, yeah. And also the smells and the bells and the sounds all went too. Which
No incense in the
no,
parts of
I mean now sort of high church, high Anglican, you've got it everywhere, but no, yeah.
Open it up to you guys now. We've got 10 more minutes for a few questions. Gentleman at the front here.
No, I don't think so. I think more in the Spanish Inquisition would have been killed. Well, it depends.
Repeat the question. Yeah.
Yes. The question was, were more people killed in Elizabeth's reign than during the Spanish Inquisition? And I don't think so. Although I think
it sounds wrong to me.
It sounds wrong. Although I suppose it depends. Sometimes people date the Spanish Inquisition differently, and some people start it much earlier, and some people start in 1492 or whatever. So possibly on the narrower thing. But no, I mean actually not that many people. Of course, any death is bad from persecution, but 280 or so. It's not. I mean actually no, 180. It's not that many. Yeah.
No, it's definitely wrong then. 180.
Yeah.
Up here, lady in the yellow jersey. Yeah.
Hello. Hi. I just wanted to know what made you pick this topic to study in so much detail?
Thank you. What made me pick this topic to study in so much detail? Many reasons, actually. The first thing to say, which I've just said, is I'm not Catholic, so I don't have a confessional agenda. But I think it's just sort of a sense of injustice, really. I was never really taught it. They were given a paragraph, maybe, the Catholics.
But you did have Mary killing Protestants.
We did have Mary and Bloody Mary, and so it was very much Catholics bad, Protestants good. And it was only really when I was at university, sort of reading all the literature, that I sort of thought, hang on a bit. And the historiography is very interesting. There was a review in 1956 in the New Statesman by the historian Hugh Trevor Roper, and a lot of books have been written, mainly Jesuit biographies by Jesuit writers. And in this review, it's called Twice Martyred. It was a review essay, and he basically said, oh, these martyrs are becoming bores. They're being martyred again by all these historians. And he had a point, actually. They were very, very partisan. So, but I find that quite interesting that sort of in Catholic schools, like with you, they're taught, the Catholic martyrs and the saints and the heroes, and I'm taught complete opposite. So it was
interesting. It varies from school to school and religious order to religious order. I was taught by Benedictine monks who were quite liberal, but the Jesuits, I once gave a lecture at Stonyhurst, and they still have a room full of religious relics.
Yes, they do.
Relics with, and again, it's very Al-Qaeda. They have cloths which have been dipped in the blood of the martyrs. Someone has picked it, gone up to the corpse, rubbed the cloth in blood, and it's kept 400 years later in a gold chasuble in a school.
Yeah, and they have a bit of rope that Campion was tied with, and actually the most grisly thing there, they have the right eyeball of Edward Alcorn, who was a Jesuit priest. He was executed after the Gunpowder Plot, as was Henry Garnet.
How did they get the eyeball?
Well, it popped out, apparently. And we know it's the right one, because on the back in Latin it says oculus dextra. We know it's the right eyeball. They're very careful about their provenance, aren't they? And actually, the Gunpowder Plot, just one quick thing, talking about Henry Garnet. He was dragged from a priest hole after the plotters were all killed. And Anne Vaux, again, hid him. 7 days and 7 nights, he had a little reed through the wall, through the masonry, so he could have soups and drinks, so he survived. But in the end, they pulled the house apart so much that they pulled him out, and he was executed in the end. And Anne was arrested, and she was interrogated in Tower of London. And again, it's just this sort of character of hers. She said, well, of course I knew about the Gunpowder Plot. I'm a woman. Women know about everything, don't you know? And she said, well, of course Henry Garnet was the ringleader. You keep telling me he's the greatest traitor in the world. He wouldn't have missed it. And then she said, and thank you very much for giving me board and lodging, because no one else in London is pushing me up. And they said, they threw their arms up in the air. They released
the Tower of London.
In the Tower of London. And they said, we absolutely do not know what to do with that woman. Quote, that woman.
Gentleman here.
Two parts of the question, if I'm allowed. Thank you. One, the little bit philosophical and another the historical one. The historical one, the Catholics were the major population of the England were Catholics, if I'm not mistaken.
I say again more clearly, sir.
The Catholics were in the majority, were they or not?
Were the Catholics evangelical?
No, in the majority.
Oh, in the
majority.
majority.
So even the forces were more Catholic. They were more Catholic in the forces. So how was the Elizabeth able to govern and have that kind of
Figures
control?
Catholics against
Figures of Catholics. Well, at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, you might be right. But the moment the state turned officially Protestant and everyone had to go to Protestant church services, then great swathes of the population became, on paper, Protestant. And obedience is a really important thing at this time. There's the whole divine right of kings thing going on. So people genuinely believed that the ruler had the right to dictate them.
They became Protestants more. And
Sorry? So then as the reign goes on, there'll be people in the 1580s who've been baptized in the Protestant faith and they don't know anything about Catholicism. But yeah, the statistics are hard because a lot of people went under the radar and they would maybe hear mass at home afterwards. Or some of them, at the most extreme level, they would go to Protestant church services all their lives and seem as though they're good Protestants, and then they'd have the Catholic last rites at the very last minute. So are they Protestant, are they Catholic? But yeah, 40,000 or so, John Bossy estimated. So it's 1% of the population.
Second is your views on radicalization. As you said that Elizabeth was under a constant threat, and there were plots and all that. So do you see radicalization and fear connected to each other, or there's another side to it as you study as a historian? Thank you.
You see radicalization. You see growing radicalization among the Catholics.
Yes. Do I see radicalization among the Catholics? Certainly, and that's sort of what I touched on with the second generation. The gunpowder plotters were all second generation recusants, by which I mean, their parents were the ones who were fined and who were broken and who sort of waited for something to get better, and it didn't. And the gunpowder plotters were sort of, most of them were angry young men. They were in their early 30s and they were impatient for change. The new monarch comes along, says everything's going to get better. It doesn't. The fines carry on. Everything carries on. And these guys, also they're quite bored. If you don't take the oath of supremacy, rejecting the Pope, you can't hold office under the crown. So you can't be a public official, and you can't be a judge, or you can't lead an army for the Queen. So they had real restricted opportunities, and so they do become. Some of them become radicalized. Some of them, of course, don't. Most of them don't. But yeah, they do, and it's very interesting. And actually, also, these Catholics, not all of them would just quietly have a priest in their house and hear mass occasionally. They were very actively trying to convert the country, some of them. I mean, the whole Jesuit mission, you have the priests doing that, but there are all sorts of other things. I mean, there's a chapter in my book that's about exorcism, and it's really harrowing. I remember reading it in a document in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and again, it's that strange thing when a Catholic's writing it saying, isn't this great? And it's a 15-year-old girl. She was tied to a chair. She was forced to drink hallowed drinks, they called them, basically some oily stuff that made her sick. And she had brimstone, sulfur, burnt under her nose until they said that her face was as black as a chimney sweep's. And there was this whole thing going on. There was also relics were put all over her body, including her private parts. And eventually the devil, after this long battle between the priests and the devil, he was taken out, and she was dispossessed. And the Catholic writer says, isn't this great? This is a great showcase for the power of the priesthood. And so it's, they were radicalized towards terrorism, if we want to call it that, but also just in many other ways as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand for amazing Jessie Giles.
Thank you.